Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session, Electrical Rate Structures, Importance of Analysis. So I'm Bob Knoedler from Hanson. With me today is Matt Coalson, and we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of electrical rate structures in that analysis as it relates to energy management. So it's going to be an interesting discussion because we're talking about a few case studies Matt's going to share with you. I'm going to work through a couple of problems, and we're going to talk about what's going on in the industry today, because there's really quite a bit going on. We've got a situation right now where the administration's pushing for electrification. It's a big deal. Let's move everything to electricity. So that's what we want to talk a little bit about today. I did a similar presentation, a 2-hour presentation for AESP towards the end of last year, which is the Association of Energy Service Providers. And so we're going to, and some of the material is in this one as well. So we're going to go through the mandatory slides, which we're obligated to do for AIA Continuing Education. Talks a little bit about what the course is about, a little bit about the overview. Let's go back for a second. We want to talk about the importance of analysis. You know, why is it important to take a look with respect to your client or your customer? Talk a little bit about national electrical cost and trends, various electrical rate structures, and there's a lot going on in that industry, and we'll talk about it as we go through. Matt's going to share a couple of case studies. We're going to work through a couple sample problems, kind of showing you the potential problems of using blended rate structures, blended electrical rates. Talk about best practices, and then wrap up talking about different resources and a summary. So with that, Matt, talk a little bit about analysis.
The position that I come from tends to be boots on the ground and running these calculations for energy audits and doing these types of things. So that's really the perspective that I start from. When you are doing a utility analysis, oftentimes the owner will hand you off a wonderful spreadsheet or access to their portfolio manager system. And you know as soon as you get it, it's going to save you time, but you also need to make sure that you are double checking and verifying against actual utility bills. If you can get access to their utility, the website where their utility company holds these bills, great, even better, but you have to validate what they have in their spreadsheet versus the actual utility bills if you're ever going to find potential errors in accounting. Human error pops up all the time, especially when people are fat-fingering in numbers from a utility bill into their specific spreadsheet. And these are the kind of things that you want to highlight, and be polite about it if you catch an error on your owner's part. Some other things that you want to make sure that you're doing is you're developing a benchmark. You are making sure you understand where this building that you're analyzing stands against other peer building types. It is going to highlight just how deep of a dive you have to do to find energy savings, to find kilowatt demand reductions for that particular building owner. Once you have a general assessment of how they are using energy, you are going to want to understand what the rate structures are for the utility company. You need to identify, is the rate that they are currently on the best rate for them? Because I promise the utility company thinks it's the best rate for them, but what about for the actual building owner? And there are huge amounts of variability. It's regional variability. It is local utility variability. Almost no two utilities are alike, and you have to understand what those specific rate structures are. And we're going to toss in some resources at the end of this to help you figure that out. And then eventually you may establish a blended rate, but a lot of times, and that's something that we're going to focus a lot on today, a blended rate is not the best way to analyze a utility bill, especially if you're looking at load shifting, peak shaving, or if you're having to deal with time of day use rates that vary significantly.
So I want to talk a little bit about electrical trends and rate and costs, and we talked a little bit about that. Now what's interesting here is these pie charts actually come from data you can see as of 2022. EIA is the Energy Information Administration. It's part of DOE, and they keep track of this. So this is your own government giving you this information, okay? So even though you hear maybe on a regular basis, we need to move to electricity, everybody has to purchase an electric vehicle, there's not gonna be any problem with it. One of the questions that we ask when I teach the EMP course for energy managers is, where do you think the bulk of electricity comes, you know, within the United States? What's the fuel source? And we get different answers, but one of the things that I would say, you know, taking a look at this, would be that this big pie chart here shows you natural gas at 40%. So 40% of electricity is produced by natural gas. You can see over there 20% by coal, a very small percentage by petroleum, nuclear 18. Then you have all renewables at 21%. So renewable energy right now represents 21% of the electricity in the United States. But then you have to drill down on that. So when you look at this expanded pie chart to the right, you see that all these different parts of renewables, and you can see hydropower, photovoltaic. So there's your solar PV right there, 3%. It's actually, that's kind of rounded up. It's actually between 2.8 and 2.9%. So no matter what you may think you're getting with respect to solar PV and electricity, that's where it is today. Now it is growing at a rapid expanding pace, but still that's very small. And to think that we're going to move all the way to renewables by 2030, it's not going to happen, okay? So there's still going to have to be a mix. So that kind of gives you an idea, and that's sort of important, and part of that plays into when you're looking at costs and you're dealing with utilities to find out what's their primary source of generation? What are they using as far as generation, or what mix, I should say, maybe? So electricity cost with respect to the major components, and you really have three, okay? And that's what we're looking at here. The generation of the electricity is roughly 56%. That's 56% of the cost as it relates to the utility. Transmission is 31%, distribution's 31%, and if you take a look at that, and that's not right, that's not the right percentage. I think transmission's less than that. We got an error on that slide. The difference is transmission, okay, those are your high voltage lines. That's going from the plant out to the substations. The last piece, distribution, that's going from the substations to the individual ones. And then the two comments that we make there, bundled rate and unbundled rate. If you have a regulated utility, which most states have, there's about 18 that are deregulated. Texas is deregulated. Basically, customers can negotiate, okay, who their provider is, and there may be a separate one that provides the transmission distribution. Most all regulated states, you have a bundled rate. You get one bill. And that particular utility, for example, in Florida, Florida Power and Light or Jacksonville Electric Authority, you know, they basically both provide the transmission distribution and the generation. So one of the things to talk about is gathering data. Matt talked a little bit about that. Again, looking at the energy bills, trying to verify some of those energy bills. Additional data, submetering. The deal is you want to drill down. You want to take a look at what are your biggest users of electricity within your building. Not only electricity, we're focusing on that today, but any other fuel sources you're using. If you're using natural gas, if there's anything else that you're using. You want to establish a load profile, and you want to be able to correlate that profile with weather data. So you want to, that's why you want to get several years. You want to see if there's any anomalies that might happen, okay? One of the most interesting things is, because of the pandemic, you've got a couple of years there, 2020 and 2021, okay, where a lot of the commercial buildings were lightly occupied or maybe even unoccupied, and so you've got some anomalies in that data right there. So you may want to go back 5, 6, or 7 years. And then what kind of tools or spreadsheets do you want to use? Do you have to do computerized energy modeling? Because in the end, you're looking to create an energy balance, okay? And what you're trying to do is drill down, okay? You want to see, okay, how much energy is being consumed, okay, for your customer in his building or buildings by fuel source. You know, how much electricity, how much natural gas. You want to define what that energy balance is, how much for each fuel source. Then you want to drill down within that. What are the biggest users of fuel or electricity? Let's say if it's electricity, you've got lighting, you've got HVAC, you've got process or plug loads. And then if you've got any large ones, you drill down again. HVAC, how much is for fans? How much is for cooling? How much is for any other, pumping, things like that. Again, the idea is to establish a baseline. The baseline is for your building or your client's building, and then from there you go out and do benchmarking against peer facilities. So let's talk a little bit about electrical rate structures, and this is what's interesting. There's a lot of work going on, a lot of incentives going on. We'll talk about it as we go through here. The old days, well, even today, the way that they're structured, the idea of a rate structure for a utility obviously is to recover the cost that they had. You saw that pie chart I gave you for generation, transmission, distribution, to recover those costs in making the service available, okay? Demand charges, as you can see there, costs associated with demand charge, those are capital or operating costs incurred by the utility. Supply charges are usually tied directly to how much energy you use, how much electricity that you use, and that's measured in kilowatt hours, okay? So there's usually at least two components, but they may even divide those components even further. We'll talk a little bit about that. So for a long time, the most prominent form of electrical rate was a flat rate structure, and you basically paid a fixed cost of the energy. Now, there may be a little variation bill to bill based on the fuel cost. They may have a fuel cost adjustment or a tax on that. So again, here, an example is, let's say, 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Then you see a lot of seasonal flat rates, and this is where a utility will charge you one incremental cost in the winter and a separate one in the summer. Okay, and part of that's because what their demand is and what their costs are. Because seasonally, typically you see higher demand for electricity in the summer. Most of your cooling equipment is driven by electricity. Whereas in the winter, okay, you have a lot of heating that's done by natural gas, some other source. So when they do that, they have a rate for summer, rate for winter, and then they define what that summer period is, as you can kind of see there. Then you have what they call tiered billing, okay? And this is a sample of a bill right there, where with tiered billing, there are two or more rates for different amounts of usage. In other words, there's some threshold amount, and you pay a certain rate up to that threshold, and then beyond that threshold, the rate changes. Now, this particular bill is a residential bill, and you can kind of see the base charge was $8.99. The rate structure is RS1. Non-fuel, for the first 1,000 kilowatt hours, you paid this incremental amount. Over 1,000 kilowatt hours, you paid this. They calculated out to $121. Same on the fuel side. So they have non-fuel and fuel. They've actually divided these two. You don't always see that, but the bottom line is the tiered rate structure has a threshold, and when you exceed that, a lot of times the usage, they may charge you less, they may charge you more. It depends on the utility. It depends on what they see in terms of their demand. So that's tiered. Time of use rates, and this is what we see a lot of now. These time of use rates, these were actually mandated by the government many years ago. They basically told utilities you have to offer, if you are a utility above a certain threshold amount of generation, which I figured at the time was around 50 or 100 megawatts, then they had to offer to their customers time of use rates. And as you see here, it talks about the fact that those will vary 2 to 4 times a day. And the diagram on the right kind of shows you, for example, how they may structure that. And you can see there, off-peak was 6.3 cents, mid-peak 9.9, and on-peak 11.8. Okay? These vary widely, and they may vary by season, they may vary by time of day, or day of the week, so on and so forth. And it can be even way beyond this. There's actually a co-op utility in Texas that actually has 5 different rates on any given day. And they start out with like economy, it's like super economy, normal, peak, super peak. So think about it, you've got 5 different rates on any given day. So with respect to your customer and with respect to maybe you as a consultant, you've got to try to work with them to say, okay, how can we shift, your demand and or your consumption in such a way to try to optimize, your bill in terms of what you're paying. Now, these time of use rates, there's a lot of incentives now with respect to utilities that will actually allow you, this is especially true in New York and in California, to have a second meter if you have an electric vehicle, and they will allow you to have 2 vehicles for your service, 1 specifically for charging, and they'll allow you to have 2 separate rates. We can go into, we don't have time today to go into that detail, but there's a lot going on in the industry. And then, let me go back. So then beyond that, we've got demand charge. Let me make sure that, so demand charge is the other component of most bills, okay? A lot of, on the commercial side, you pay for the consumption. The consumption is in kilowatt hours, how much energy you're using. The demand, as it says here, that may have been what was your highest demand, the most energy you were requiring, for a 15-minute period during the day. But even that may vary, okay? It kind of depends about the rate structure, and you can kind of see down below. Time of use demand charges. Okay, those say that I'm going to charge you for demand, but it's based upon the peak demand during the peak period of your time of use rate, okay? Non-coincident demand charges are whatever your peak was, whether it was during a peak period or whether it was off-peak, whatever the most amount of kW you were demanding, that's going to be your demand charge. A look back, a ratchet clause, means that they will look back, and once you establish a peak, that they will charge you according to that peak, okay, for several months. In other words, until you hit a certain threshold amount, they're going to charge you what that maximum demand was. Again, they vary by utility. Net metering. So now we've got a lot of owners, a lot of people that have on-site, generation, what they call distributed generation. A lot of them are allowed to self-consume their power. Okay, so if they're generating their own electricity, okay, if they don't need it, they may inject that into the grid. In other words, any excess goes into the grid. They get some sort of a credit, and that could be valued at wholesale or retail amount. Sometimes those credits are given to you on a monthly basis. Sometimes they're held back, and quarterly, the utility basically reconciles with you for how much was generated versus how much you consumed. And then you're billed basically for the net, what the net energy consumption was. And it may have a bidirectional meter, you may have 2 individual meters. That's what they call net metering. I don't have a slide on it, but they also have what they call buy all, sell all. Buy all, sell all means that you have somebody that generates power. You've got your solar grid, solar farm. Everything you generate goes into the grid, everything. Everything you consume comes from the utility. So they pay you a certain amount for everything you generate. You pay them for everything you consume. That's what they call buy all, sell all. So you can kind of see from these slides that I'm going through today that there's a wide variation of different types of structures out there. And as we go through the presentation, you'll see that there's even more as we go forward. So this is kind of a graphic representation here, and you can kind of see here, for example, this was the kilowatt hours that were basically received from the customer. This is basically what he was generating and sending into the grid. This is what he basically used from the utility. This was the net difference, you know, whether he was injecting or consuming, okay? And this is just an example of graphically of what I'm talking about with respect to net metering. Energy delivered to you minus energy received from you. So beyond that, we talk a little bit more about procuring energy. We're talking about in regulated states, that's being controlled by, you know, you are basically dictated, you know, to work with the utility that's in your regional area, okay? Now again, like we talked about, they have a lot of different rates, and on behalf of your client or customer, you would want to go out and explore those. Deregulated states like Texas, there's about 18 of them, it's a marketplace, and you can go out and negotiate, and there's actually energy managers, that's their little niche. Their negotiations and their ability to work with their customer. And then alternate supply options, including dynamic pricing, various renewable, and PPA. We're going to talk a little bit about power purchase agreements. So a power purchase agreement is a contract between two parties, okay? One develops and generates the electricity, and the other one looks to purchase the electricity, okay? And if you see a lot of times in news releases, particularly with your high-tech companies, they'll say, you know, Facebook, Google, Apple, whoever, just signed an agreement to purchase all the electricity coming from some new solar farm for the next 10, 20, 25 years, okay? That's a power purchase agreement, okay? The customer purchased the output for a predetermined period at a negotiated price. You know, allows the customer to receive stable electricity. Developer takes advantage of tax credits, and of course he receives the income from the sale of the electricity. Even within power purchase agreements, there's a variety. Obviously, there's the physical agreement. The physical agreement means that you're signing an agreement with this developer. He's built the farm, you're taking his electricity. There's what they call virtual PPAs. Virtual PPA means there's really no change in electricity. What you're buying are credits, renewable energy credits. In other words, the developer is generating the electricity, he's injected it into the grid, you're taking electricity from the grid, but you're paying for a credit for the amount that he's generating at some level, okay? There's all kind of variations. We can't go into all that detail today, but again, I'm trying to give you a flavor for what's out there in the system, okay? And a lot of times in a PPA, you may have a institution, okay, or somebody that's got a lot of land, and so they will actually negotiate an agreement to have that particular, on a physical situation, have that generating capacity, that renewable system on their property, okay? And it's still going to be developed by an outside developer, okay? For example, airports do that. There's a couple airports that have done similar things to that. Key considerations for power purchase agreements: the volume generated for the purchase, the contract term, the pricing structure, what the growth rate or expansion may be of that particular renewable plant or renewable farm, what the risk may be, price volatility over a period of time. These are all things that have to be considered. This is a slide I just added because of something I was reading the other day. Out in California, and remember, California oftentimes leads the way. Whatever happens in California starts to move east, okay? So The legislature out in California, and I understand this is residential, and maybe you don't work in the residential market, you're more on the commercial or industrial market, but they passed what they call Assembly Bill 205. And basically that mandates that utilities have to structure rates now based upon individuals' incomes. So if you make more money, you're going to pay a higher rate than somebody that doesn't make as much money, okay? So to give you an idea, the utilities have come back. This is not in effect yet. It's looking to start in 2024, 2025, okay? And I was unaware of this, but I wanted to share it with you. So what we're talking about here is they've broken the income levels. So that you're a resident, and this is, if you make between $28,000 and $69,000, and these are the three major utilities out in California. You've got Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Pacific Gas and Electric, okay? So these are your base charges, your base, you saw what the other day. So at that income level, $20 a month, $34, $30. As you ratchet up to $69,000 to $180,000, there's your base charge. If you go above $180,000 a year, there's your base charge, $8,528, $92. That's your base charge, okay? In addition to that, you will be charged for how much consumption, how much kWh. So in other words, how much electric you consume at some unit rate will be added to that base charge. But this is the first time I've seen rates, in fact, I don't know any other state except California that's proposing to charge people based upon their income.
Electric use charge the same for different incomes?
I don't know. The article that I read, when I saw that, this was just their base. They did not talk about any adjustment in the unit cost, in the consumption cost.
Do you know if that's gross taxable?
Is it gross tax or net income? That I don't know. The article didn't get into that much detail, okay? But no, it's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate question. But how many people would have thought that utilities would get to a point, or let's say government would get to a point to authorize utilities to start billing based on your income? Go ahead.
Did it mention anything about if this is applying to only residential customers or?
This is strictly residential. No, there's nothing in there about commercial at this point. This is strictly residential, okay? So, but I understand your question. You start looking from a corporate sense, how much money a corporation makes, and do you start structuring it that way? So, gives you an idea. So, Matt's going to talk a little bit about some case studies and what he found out. Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you very much, Bob. So we have done any number of energy audits, carbon neutrality studies, and this specifically is a carbon neutrality study that we did for a large real estate company that owns many hundreds of millions of square feet of property up and down the East Coast. The company we were actually working for was underneath the umbrella of a larger company. This is tourist real estate. They have a smaller company underneath them called Renew. Renew's purpose is to look through tourists' portfolio of real estate, identify properties where they see a value add by going in, performing an energy audit, making upgrades, making this someplace that you can sell as an energy efficient green home or green office space. So we've done a couple of these for Renew now, and this specific one was multifamily residential. Almost 300 individual units, 8 different unit types. On the surface level, a pretty standard energy audit. You should upgrade to heat pumps. You should change out your thermostat so that you have a smart thermostat that responds to the occupants. these kind of things. But what they also wanted to do is they also wanted to add solar to this location. Any of the south-facing roofs, they wanted to put solar on. It's not enough solar to cover all of the energy use. Not every tenant wants to sign up for solar PV. That's an option that they want to be able to provide to their tenants. But if you have a single source of electricity, how do you divide it up amongst 300 some odd tenants? What subdivision of that 300 tenants is actually going to want to pay extra? That's a choice they get to make. But then you would have to submeter every single location, and suddenly it's cost prohibitive. It doesn't make a bit of sense. The gentleman that heads up Renew is an incredibly smart man, wonderful to work with this sophisticated of a client. Slips us a white paper on a piece of equipment that's out of Australia, never been used in the United States, called a loom. And it's an advanced submeter. What this piece of equipment does is takes the solar input in behind the utility meter, will gauge the demand from any tenant that has signed up for this, will offset as much of that demand as is possible, divided amongst the number of people, up to 60 per each one of these, so that you are matching supply and demand based on current usage, and you're optimizing for that. The utility company has never seen this before. Like I said, it hasn't been done in the United States. So our piece of this pie was setting up that conversation with the local utility company, was making sure that our client was able to get into the right rooms to make the utility company comfortable with something they had never seen before. It's being installed. This piece of it has been installed. They're still working on some of the energy retrofit upgrades beyond that. But the solar piece is in, and they currently have 9 of the tenants signed up for this, being subdivided, and offering it to any new tenants that come in. Wonderful piece of technology, and really solves a difficult challenge that anyone that has considered installing solar on a multifamily residential or an apartment complex has run into. Another project that we are currently in the midst of, we are currently developing an energy roadmap for JFK Terminal 4. This is helping them to meet their carbon neutrality goals. They have a long list of requirements that have been handed down from the state, and frankly, they are very much invested in the idea of hitting their targets. They have a very unique situation with their utility provider, something that you're probably not going to run into a lot of places. The Port Authority, who provides them their utilities, both chilled water, their medium temperature hot water, and their electrical usage, the only demand that utility has is the airport. One supplier, one customer. That puts the customer into a very unique position. It allows them a lot of leverage when they're having negotiations with their utility provider about how much they should be paying. That said, the utility company also has a lot of leverage about saying, well, if you want us to generate more power, guess what you get to buy us? It's an interesting dynamic, and it's an ongoing conversation, and it's one that, frankly, the airport has had success with recently. This was before we got here, so I don't get to take credit for this one. But it highlights a really interesting possibility, and also highlights something that Bob and I are really getting at here today is each one is unique. There's so much variability, and the sorts of rate structures that exist in this country that you need to look at these things specifically and figure out what your angle is to get the best return on investment for your client, for the owner, phrase it how you want. In 2021, JFK Airport negotiated a decrease in price per KBTU of chilled water. Take a look at that graph. They saved millions of dollars a year through this renegotiated rate structure. At the same time, they had a corresponding increase in their medium temperature hot water cost, and the differential for the two was the same, but the volume of chilled water versus medium temperature really worked out in the airport's favor. A lot of this negotiation came out of work that was done and things that were identified during the pandemic when the total demand dropped so significantly. They were able to identify a few items that they had not been aware of before. Now, things that this really highlights for us as we go in to discuss with their utility company, where are they projected to go? How is JFK going to hit these carbon neutrality goals? Because JFK can do all the energy efficiency improvements that they want. They can make the tightest envelope, they can use the highest efficiency air handling units, but at the end of the day, if the power they are getting from their utility provider, their Scope 2 energy, is generating CO2, they're never going to hit carbon neutrality. They're never going to hit their stated goals. So, okay, Port Authority, what are your plans for reducing your carbon output? Are you building new energy generation? How are you going to supply expansion of the airport, and how are you going to prepare for that energy generation? Are you going to build a new natural gas plant, which is what they use predominantly? All of these questions help us outline and help JFK plan for the future what makes the most sense, where their biggest bang for their buck is for reducing their carbon output. Does it make sense to switch over to more electric, or does it still make more sense to increase their natural gas usage? These are questions that help them achieve their goals. City of Asheville, we did an energy audit for them a while back, and this was relative to the other two that we've talked about here, a much more standard energy audit. They came to us with specific requests saying, you know, we know we're paying a lot for kilowatt demand charges. It's a significant percentage of our utility bills. So yes, we want to reduce energy overall, we want to save money, main priority, main focus, but within that study, let's also take a good hard look at kilowatt demand reduction, because we believe there's a chunk of savings there. Frankly, a lot of the stuff we came up with was very standard. This building was built in the 1910s. You know what? You may want to switch to LED lighting. You may want to do something along the lines of demand control ventilation. Hey, one good idea here, you've got a multi-story building with several floors not being used. Maybe you put those unused floors into unoccupied mode. That's a thought. And of course, optimal start routines was a big deal in this as well. If you do tiered start times for individual floors or even groups of floors, you can really reduce that peak demand of cooling and heating at a given time of year. But the piece of this one that I found the most interesting, and the one-hit wonder that I always love to find when doing these energy audits, a single FIM, or a single energy efficiency manager, that will pay the total fee that they paid for me to be there. It was built in the teens. They initially had a coal-fired furnace with a beautiful brick flue that went straight up out the building that they hadn't used since the 1970s. And this was still open to the outside air. Patch it. That was our recommendation. You should close that off. You should not let that outside air in year-round. And hard to quantify that exact dollar amount. We did model it with energy modeling software, and we gave them that best estimate, but something that is absolutely going to be the biggest single energy efficiency improvement beyond any shadow of a doubt of anything that we recommended, and reduce that kilowatt demand for them as well.
So I guess two things. Number one of the things that Matt's hitting on here is, and we've talked about it, is what I call the evolution of audits. And the fact that we have clients now coming to us, and I've talked to other engineers as well, they're seeing the same thing. And what was originally or conventionally, like you said, maybe an energy audit, we're seeing it now to be much more expansive, much more comprehensive. Clients are coming to us asking, look at resiliency, look at sustainability, look at decarbonization or net zero. They want a more comprehensive review of their facilities than just what can I do to save energy. So I want to go through a couple of problems here quick. I want to talk about a couple things. Being an engineer and teaching the EMP course, I try to give people tools and talk a little bit about it, including some outside links. So we'll talk a little bit about, let's go. So blended electrical rate, and this is something we talked about as we started today, the fact that a lot of engineers use what they call a blended electrical rate when they're evaluating energy conservation measures. Instead of trying to identify specifically what the demand savings is or what maybe the consumption savings is, they say, look, I'm going to basically come up with a blended rate, basically take it for the annual use, and then I'm going to use that one number, that unit cost, to calculate my anticipated or projected savings. So again, it's commonly used. It may be acceptable in a lot of cases, but in some cases it's not going to be, and we're going to show you that. We're going to talk a little bit about it. You got to understand the limitations. Blended rates usually are reasonable for dollar savings on certain types of measures, and you can kind of see the examples there below. On the right, you see it could be a little bit low on the dollar savings, and you can see some of those examples. Now, these are rough rules of thumb, and some of these have to be thrown out now, and I'll tell you why in a second. Blended rates overstate dollar savings when you look at some of those that you see there on the left. And blended rates understate dollar savings when you see some of the stuff on the right. The problem is that, what did I start out today? I talked about all these different rates and the fact that you've got tiered rates, the fact you've got seasonal rates, the fact you've got time of day rates. All of that starts to factor in and starts to compromise the use of a blended electrical rate. So we're going to look at a couple different problems here. We'll just start with a real simple one, because this is something that an EMP, energy manager, or maybe you as a consultant is asked to do. Here's a small commercial client has asked an EMP to evaluate 2 alternate electrical rates by the local utility. His average monthly consumption is 2,800 kilowatt hours, okay? So the fixed rate option is 13 cents a kilowatt hour. A tiered rate, which the utility says he could use that if he wanted, 1 to 400 kilowatt hours is 9 cents. Everything over 400 to 1,000 is 12. Everything over 1,000 is 15. What rate should he recommend? This is very simplistic. It's easy to calculate by hand. But again, fixed rate at that, $364. Okay, tiered rate, you just break that 2,800 into the 3 sections. You calculated $378. So if he's averaging 2,800 kilowatt hours, the fixed rate plan is better. Okay? So again, these can get more complicated, but what I want to show you is that there's tools. Let's go back here. There's a lot of tools on the internet. Okay, and this particular one is a spreadsheet that was developed by Penn State University. And it is a comparison. It's basically an Excel spreadsheet. It compares fixed to tiered rates. And it gives you the capability of going in, and you can insert what the unit rate is for your fixed rate. You can then inject what the rates are in at least 3 different tiers, and then you can put in what your consumption is, and then the output comes out, and it'll tell you, this will go from green to red. It'll either say fixed rates better, or it'll say tiered rates better. These will jump from green to red. The other beauty that it does is in this output, it will calculate what the break point is. It'll tell you what level of consumption, kilowatt hours, it trips from one to the other, okay? So it's a nice little tool. It's free. You can download it, okay? But there's other tools as well. Even as I mentioned earlier, some of the utilities even have basic calculators out there, algorithms, so that you can log in. If you're a customer, you can put in your utility data and you can compare some of the rate structures that they have. Now, briefly, and I'm going to go through this pretty quick. So here we have the table data on a month-to-month basis with the totals. You have a winter energy charge of 4.3 cents, a summer of 6.8, transmission distribution charge of 7.6 cents, demand is $10 a kW, usage tax is 4%. Summer is defined as May to September, okay? So here's the question, and this gets into this later. What dollar savings would be achieved for an energy conservation measure that saves 11,000 kilowatt hours and 50 kW per month? So you've come up with a measure and you've calculated or projected that you're going to save 11,000 kilowatt hours in consumption, 50 kW in demand every month, 12 months a year. So if I do that with the incremental dollars that we just talked about, the rates that we talked about on the last one, I can crank through the calculations here. Let's go back. I can crank through the calculations, savings in winter, savings in summer, demand savings, transmission distribution, subtotal, tax. My total savings would be $24,006, but it took me a while to calculate that. People like to use a blended electrical rate, so let's do it the other way. Blended electrical rate uses the annual total consumption, okay? So what we're going to do here, we've got the total demand for the year. The total demand is 24,480, $10. Winter, summer, those are the totals. Transmission distribution, you don't include tax when you do this calculation for blended electrical rate. You come up with a total, you divide it by the total consumption in kilowatt hours. Your blended electrical rate is 22.3 cents. So if we take the blended electrical rate times our projected savings, which was from the last slide, and I think my batteries went out. Go back one. Okay. We said 24,000. Go up one again. 29,000. So see, blended electrical rate here would give you an estimated savings $5,000 more than if we had done it in the increments that we did. So my only thing here is a cautionary tale of be very careful if you start doing that, because the new rate structures, and depending on what your measures are.
So we need to look at just basically a summary. What are the best practices when you were performing these energy audits, when you were looking at how the utility rate structures applies to energy savings, and generally speaking, just optimal operation. You need to take a look at what those invoices are looking at. You need to consider doing these energy audits or retro commissioning. Some items like peak shaving and load shifting and demand response. Now, submetering is going to move you very far ahead in understanding that energy use breakdown where we started at. And more, this is being implemented into code. California's Title 24 has different structure rates for submetering for 50 to 250 kVA, 250 to 1,000, and then 1,000 plus kVA. New York, anything over 50,000 square feet has got to have HVAC and lighting submetered. Seattle, they've got an interesting one where they demand that when you were large enough to have to submeter, you also have to put a screen that shows energy use per floor in your building so that you can have, so that you can start to adjust individual behavior. You can start talking about competitions in inner office about who's using the most energy per floor. Making sure you're getting these energy audits, making sure you're running through the retro commissioning. From my point of view in the realm that I work in, this seems completely obvious, but you need to do analysis of how your operations are running. You need to make sure you understand the equipment that you're using and what condition it's in. Shocking amount of time, owners simply run till failure. And if you want to save money If you want to optimize your building's performance, run to failure is not the smart choice.
Okay, so, some of the other things out there that engineers or consultants need to consider are like peak shaving and load shifting, and whether it's done manually, there's a manual intervention to start shedding loads, or whether there's some automatic shedding if you start to get close to your peak. These are the things that are out there. You have a lot of clients potentially in mission critical or other areas where it's a hospital or data center, where they have a bank of generators, and they've got the capability of basically idling at least a portion of their load back and bringing the generators on to kind of control their peak, and that's what's critical. But now what's happening is you also have in these distributed generation areas where people have perhaps solar PV, and they've installed batteries, okay? They've got the capability as well as to basically draw down at different times. Smart time of use. So this is an interesting one. So again, technology with metering out there, this is Southern California Edison. So you've got a situation where you've got in this case it's a residence, but they've got a battery service, and they've got a thing, Brightbox. So it's a smart, what they call time of use allocation. So basically what they do is they take a look and they say, okay, what times of day are most efficient to be charging the batteries? What time of day do I need if I'm starting to get high, or I go into a peak charging period in my time of use or my time of day charge? Do I want to back off and start drawing down my battery? And basically this is all done automatically between the utility and the Brightbox in your residence, okay? So this is kind of where we're at in some cases. And again, one of the reasons that a lot of these time of use, time of day rates are out there. Demand response programs, they can either be based on load, they can be based on price, but again, the concept of, in deference to the utility, if they give you some kind of consideration or some kind of compensation that allows you to curtail your load using your own backup source or standby source, in order to save energy. These are all things to be considered. Go ahead, Matt.
We've added a number of useful resources in here. Download this at your convenience, and if you can't remember where these websites are, they'll be on here for you. Utility rate database is provided. It covers, there's a website online. It is done by Open Energy Information website, which is a governmental group. You can go on here, you can hunt down your local utility, you can figure out what the utility rates are, and you can look through all of the potential rates that
There's
are available.
a link right there.
Yeah, and this covers the entire nation. A little bit more detailed look at what you'll be seeing when you get on this website. Short-term energy outlook, the Energy Information Association, again, national organization, subsidiary of the DOE. If you do not have the capacity to go talk to the utility company, if you need an outlook for them that you cannot get because they just aren't willing to have that conversation with you, this is a fallback position. This is a national outlook. Again, available online. Shocking, Google it. More information, they do publish this annual energy outlook. Bob, do you know if it's an annual publishing or if
Right.
it is?
So the short-term outlook is done on a quarterly basis, and again, the link's out there. This is that Energy Information Administration, EIA, okay? It's a component of DOE, and it looks at everything. It looks at fuel, et cetera. But then also on an annual basis, they put out a longer, more comprehensive one, and this is kind of a click of the one that was done, I think it's 2021, but you can kind of see there from the chart, it addresses not only the U.S. energy markets, but what are the drivers, fuels, transportation, buildings, industrial emissions. It has a lot of data, a wealth of information, and it's a good source, okay? So a couple quick ones, the energy escalation rate calculator. This is also out on the internet. It's also free. And this happens to be the calculator that basically ESCOs use. If you happen to have a client that enters into a performance contract, okay, where you have guaranteed savings, well, that performance contract is going to include some sort of escalator clause as it goes through the course of the contract, maybe 7 or 8 years. So this is typically the calculator that they use, okay? It's usually tied into their contracts. And then you've got this levelized cost energy calculator. This is another calculator. This is the one that people will use to try to look at and evaluate the cost of installing. We talked about those power purchase agreements and the fact that if you were to, what's the cost to install a separate generating facility, typically a renewable one like a solar farm, and then that versus, okay, buying from a utility. So again, forecasting energy cost, coordinate with the utility. The best source is with the utility. You want to talk to them about rates and then what they anticipate your costs are. And then if you have to use that information to adjust your client's baseline or to adjust an energy model, you need to be able to do that and document it going forward. So in summary, what we're trying to say today is examining utility rate structures, costs, being able to be conscious of the fact that you have a lot of clients out there that are concerned not only of just energy measures. To do just service, they're also interested in, as I said, sustainability, decarbonization. Matt talked about a couple of those. They're interested in resiliency. Resiliency is one of the new buzzwords because of all the interruptions that you see now, weather-related and otherwise. And take a look at what the potential is in terms of not only saving energy, but how you evaluate those savings. That's why I brought up the thing about the blended electrical rates. So we're pretty tight on time, I think, but if anybody's got any questions, please feel free. Yes?
So on that, when you were shaving, load shedding using the generators, do you take the fuel being used by the generator into account when you make that overall recommendation for them? Oh.
Yeah. So one of the things, it's a good question, and it gets back to, we didn't have time today to talk about energy use index, but yes, if you were working with a client, okay, and you were helping them calculate their energy use index, in other words, what's their baseline, where they start, you have to take into account every fuel. So electricity, gas, and then let's say they have generators and they have to run those generators so many times during the year. You take the amount of fuel that they used. You want to know how much fuel you use, and you reflect everything into kBTUs. But that's all part of it. That's all part of it. Okay.
Right, but specifically, if you're telling them to load shed, or is that the utility telling them they have to?
So,
but is that fuel during that period somehow calculated so it's going to offset their total bill?
No, I understand what you're saying. You're saying the compensation that they would get. In other words, if they sign up for a demand response program, if they do that, okay,
hey, Bob,
they have to get a compensation for that.
Specific case, University of Central Florida. They've got a 5.5 megawatt generator that they have sitting on campus. They installed it about a decade ago. And the reason they installed it is because they believed that it's a natural gas generator. They believed that they could generate power on site more cheaply than they were purchasing it from the utility. It has absolutely proved out over the course of the last decade, saving them upwards right around $2 million a year by producing electricity on site. Utility company, frankly, doesn't like it. It's stolen revenue from them, but for the university, it is a net savings. And if you look and they calculate what the levelized cost of electricity that they generate versus the levelized cost of electricity that they purchase, they are generating and this was a few years ago now, and I know there's been a lot of fluctuations in natural gas prices over the last year, but they were pretty steady between 5 and 7 cents per kilowatt hour, which was about 6 cents cheaper than what they were purchasing from the grid, depending on time of rate charges. That was plus or minus a few cents.
But if you had other clients, if you had other clients like hospitals or something, or somebody else that had diesel generators, and you're saying, okay, well then any agreement that they enter into with the utility, and the utility says, look, when we get close to peak, we're going to call you up, you need to start your generators. They have to negotiate that contract saying, well, if you're going to make us run our generators, we want enough compensation that offsets and makes it advantageous for us to do that. I mean, that's part of the agreement that you have to negotiate.
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
Last talk I did on diesel was like 10 times really high. Is that what you have to say?
I frankly have never had
Diesel
anyone
has
ask me to
gone
run
way
a
up.
diesel
Yeah.
generator.
Well, diesel has gone way up, and so that's why these. But I will say this: I saw a statistic. I don't know what utilities are offering now. I will tell you this: last statistic I saw, and this was up in New York, that they had the greatest number of clients. The utility had the greatest number of clients sign up for their demand response program that they had had in years. So they must be offering some tremendous incentives that more than offset the cost of running those standby generators, okay? So I think we're at time. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate it today. Thank you very much. I guess I was glad I had. I guess I'm glad.